Everyone, lovely to see so many people on the call, and we're delighted to have our first time joining us on these webinars, our Dr. Michael Carter. Michael is a historian, he's an art historian, he specialises in monasticism, especially in the late Middle Ages, and his primary interest is in areas of monastic art and architecture, relics and their veneration, also monastic books and libraries. We're going to free talk with Michael, so this might be a bit of a different webinar for you. He's going to talk about a bit about his life, how he came into medieval history and monasticism. He's going to talk about he just wants to interact with the audience, so please feel free to just jump in. This is not going to be one of our normal webinars where we've got a lecture. It really is just an insight into Michael's work. And also, you know, because he's written a really fascinating article for the tablet. I don't know if you've read it, but, you know, interact as much as you want. Feel free to involve yourselves in the webinar as much as you want. And without further ado, I shall hand over to Michael. Over to you, Dr. Michael.
Thank you very much, and it is a real pleasure to be with you on this very, very rainy evening. And you know, some of you will have been watching the news and be very aware that a momentous event will be happening on the 4th of July. And I'm sure all of you know, when I talk about the 4th of July, the significance of the day, which of course is the feast of St. Martin in summer. That great 4th century saint, the founder of the monastery at Marmoutier near Tours, and a man whose image of him putting the cloak, a Roman soldier who was converted to Christianity and then the monastic life in an act of great charity, cuts his cloak and gives it to a beggar, always moves me. And the reason I became a monastic historian is probably because it spoke to my spirit, to my soul. But it was a very, very long journey to get there. I didn't do my PhD until I was in my early 40s. It was my midlife crisis, I suppose, rather than buying a Ferrari or buying a pair of leather trousers. I ended up packing in a very secure and looking back on it, very well-paid job. I think in both absolute and certainly real terms, I was paid much, much more than I'm being paid now at English Heritage. That was my midlife crisis. I realized I had to change directions in my life and do something I had always wanted to do. And that takes me back to the beginning of my life, I suppose. And I grew up in a working class but quite rural suburb of Leeds, West Leeds, born in 1967. My mum was Irish, my dad was English. My mum was a Catholic. My dad wasn't, although curiously, both him and his two brothers married Catholics. And his mother, who my dad told me was vociferously anti-Catholic when they were growing up, actually converted to Catholicism in old age. And I simply found out that there were probably some recusant ancestors, that's English Catholic, historic English Catholic ancestors on her maternal side of the family. And it was the way her mother had been treated at a Catholic school in Home on Spalding Moor, because her mother had had her out of wedlock, that turned them very much against that branch of the family, very much against their Catholicism. But, you know, I went to a Catholic primary school, then a Catholic middle school, and then a Catholic high school. And I was always interested in history, always from a little boy. And my first love was the Romans. And I think that had more to do with their armor and Roman soldiers than any great appreciation of Roman history. But from a very early age, I visited the ruined monasteries of Yorkshire, and especially one on which was we didn't have a car when I was growing up, so we went everywhere by public transport. We weren't very well off at all, and so we went an awful lot to Kirkstall Abbey on the outskirts of Leeds, which is one of the finest monastic ruins anywhere in this country and does deserve to be better known. And I think its urban location And when I was growing up, it was smoke blackened from the pollution of Leeds. In fact, the great architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner, when he visited Leeds whilst doing the volume of the Buildings of England on West Yorkshire, jokingly asked the city architect in his German accent, "Where did you find this beautiful black stone?" And but you know, for that reason, I think various reasons, Kirkstall Abbey has been overlooked, I think, quite unfairly, and also because it's in the care of Leeds City Council rather than one of the major heritage organisations, as a very important monastic room, which it really is. And I was awestruck by it as a child. It wasn't necessarily the relationship that was going to develop. On one of my first visits, the former lay brother's rarer daughter, the polite word invented by 19th century antiquarians for the monastic latrines, formed the on-site cafe. And whilst drinking my Kiora or whatever drink my parents had got the pennies together to buy, I was disgusted to learn that up above would have been the stalls in which the lay brothers attended to use their monastic parlance, attend to the necessities of nature. But it was certainly a relationship that blossomed, and it was aided by the fact that my grandfather, who died 3 years before I was born, had been custodian there, and that was basically just the caretaker. And as I don't know if any of you have been to Kirkstall Abbey and the Abbey House Museum, which is housed in the former 12th century gatehouse of the monastery. Within the museum, there was a reconstruction, and still is actually, of a Victorian street in Leeds. And one of the shops there was Anne Carter, milliner, and that was named after one of my great-great-grandparents. So there's a strong connection there. And also my dad, after doing his compulsory military service, briefly became a policeman in the Leeds Police, and his beat used to take in Kirkstall Abbey. And when my granddad was working nights and my dad was pounding his midnight beat, he would pop in for a cup of tea. And the story associated with the Abbey, which more than any tales of observance of the rule of St. Benedict or Cistercian austerity grabbed my attention when I was a child, was a supposed haunting of an upper room in the gatehouse where the last abbot, Abbot William Brown, was said to have retired heartbroken after the dissolution of his monastery in November 1539. His ghost, his troubled spirit, walking at night, heartbroken at the fate of his monastery, and how my grandfather used to take to work with him whilst working nights his pet Pekingese, called Pixie Carter. I think there's a joke intended there. I don't know how many of you got it. And how it would sit at the bottom of a newel or spiral staircase leading to this room, snarling and never go up. And that really did capture my imagination and sent a shiver down my spine. And I'll return to the significance of that presently. So I received a standard education for that time. It was when Leeds was introducing comprehensive education into its Catholic schools. Both my older brothers went to grammar school, took their 11 plus and went to grammar school. I was spared that, and I think I was quite lucky to be spared that, because I was quite a nervous and confident child, and I'm not in the least bit confident I would have passed it. So I went through a standard state education in Leeds, primary school, middle school, and then high school. And although I had some truly excellent and inspirational teachers whom I still think about in gratitude to this day, I also, and I'm sure this will have been a common experience with so many people, had some teachers who were nothing short of a disgrace to their profession. And I have left and caused me lasting damage. And I'm afraid that had an awful lot to do with me being singled out for being different. And so often we've been called about being singled out for being different at those times. And I remember it, you would be called a puff in the playground or such like. You know, it was related to my emergent sexuality, which I wasn't aware of, but certainly my peer group were, and I think some of the teachers. And rather than acting as champions and protectors, some of the teachers were quite the opposite. but you know, I did very well at my A levels, and I read. In fact, I got the best A levels in my year, despite being consigned to a stream at school which really wasn't supposed to go on to university. And I read ancient history as a first degree at Sheffield, and that represented a huge amount of social mobility for my family. First person in my family to go to university, and I did very well there. And I wanted to go and do postgraduate research, and I was going to do research on the late Roman Empire. Although I'd been very interested in the Roman Empire in its earlier centuries and its glory years, you know, the age of the civil wars, of the triumvirate and the civil wars, the age of Caesar, like Claudius, Trajan, Hadrian. It was the late Roman Empire that captured my imagination. I found the earlier centuries of Rome increasingly difficult to establish any kind of intellectual or true emotional connection with. And it was the empire of after the age of Constantine, the Christian Empire. And for reasons I probably didn't really understand at that time, that really intellectually engaged me and which connected my spirit as well. And something truly remarkable happening in that late Roman world. And also how narratives of the fall of the Roman Empire might not necessarily, the ones we have been brought up with, might not necessarily have been correct. And to an extent, the posthumous survival, as Kenneth Clark famously called it in Civilization, that strange posthumous survival of the Roman Empire in the East, the Byzantine Empire, really, really did interest me. But rather than going on to do some postgraduate research, which I planned at that time, I took a job being a graduate trainee in the Central Electricity Generating Board as a kind of quasi-civil service. And I didn't have a single happy memory or think I did a single useful thing in that role for 3 years. And after doing that, I started to do a MA at King's, and then I subsequently did one at Birkbeck. And by that time, my historical interest has most definitely changed. And I was very excited by historical debates unfolding at that time. This was the mid-90s, and perhaps reaching a climax in 1992 with the publication of a book a lot of you may be familiar with, which was Eamon Duffy's Stripping of the Altars, which I found a truly revelatory and exciting read, questioning these traditional narratives of late medieval Catholic decline, arguing for the enduring vibrancy and vitality and popularity of Catholicism in late medieval and early modern England. And like so many, even going to a Catholic school and doing an A-level in 17th century history at a Catholic school, the overwhelming narrative established in English historiography and established in the 16th century was one of Catholic decadence and decline, and how it was every English man and woman's birthright to be a Protestant. And, you know, and then also this slightly suspect thing of like, you know, well, you know, all these dreadful Irish people had come over, and, you know, there's some lovely, lovely ancient Catholic families, and these dreadful Irish people had come over and, you know, well, might have kept things alive, but, you know, gosh, you know, things were so much better when the Arundels were in charge and the such like. And to present with a counter narrative about Catholic vibrancy, and and also about the beauty of English medieval Catholicism, because my experiences of worship as a young boy had been pretty dour and hadn't really engaged my senses or engaged my spirit, and the beauty of late medieval Catholicism. And but the various needs to earn a living meant my career went off in very, very odd directions. And after being made redundant by, thank you very much, I was very glad to take the redundancy payment, National Power, in 1991. I ended up freelancing and then working for a number of charities, and I ended up working for HIV charities, something which affected me intimately as a young man, aged just 24 in 1991. I became desperately ill with a very bad cough, and soon found myself coughing up huge gobbets of blood and having to go to A&E. and was on exactly 33 years ago. It was in late May 1991, and probably on a day like this, actually, I was diagnosed with HIV, which in 1991 was a very, very bad diagnosis indeed. And I can remember actually very, very calm, and it was at the time, and how I found some kind of peace and some kind of solace by going to a former monastic church in London, which some of you may know. It's now Southwark Cathedral, and a church which in more recent times was a very, very radical past, and through Mervyn Stockwood and various clerics in the higher Anglican tradition, with a fondness for vestments and liturgy, which might give you some clues about some of their predictions. But there was a chapel, the Chapel of St Andrew, in its retro choir, which around about that time had been dedicated to people with HIV and AIDS, and how I can remember visiting it. I lived in Rotherhithe at that time, walking along the Thames and going there and finding incredible solace and peace and some kind of comfort, and also a long historical perspective as well. And especially it was after 1994, I became desperately ill with tuberculosis. Turned out to be tuberculosis. They didn't know. It was a very unusual diagnosis at that time in people with HIV, and very few people were seen with it. And first of all, they thought I had pneumonia. I was in hospital for a very, very long time. And it was only when, in the tradition of a Carry On movie, a consultant, an elderly consultant, came round followed by the nurses and the young house officers. I think they were still called that back then. And a rather posh doctor was asked to present my case to him, and he turned to him and said, "Why are you torturing this poor man? He's obviously got pulmonary tuberculosis. Initiate therapy this today. His fever will be gone by tomorrow morning, and he can go home." And it exactly happened. I wanted to kiss him, actually, and it happened exactly as he said. And but anyway, to return to the job narrative, it was because of that I worked for the Terence Higgins Trust, and then I worked for an organization called the National AIDS Manual, writing patient information and taking complex information and making it digestible. And whilst doing that, I met a nun who was based at a parish in Gosh, in just off the Strand, whose name I cannot now remember, and nor can I remember her name. And it is one of the great regrets of my life that I cannot, because her kindness, she embodied the true spirit of Christ, I have to say. And the service and the support she offered to people who, even in the early 2000s, which seems like a lost golden age in terms of social provision and care for the most vulnerable in our society, was starting to fall through a safety net. And the support she was able to offer them, and if I did anything to help, I am humbled by that experience, and I wish I could remember her name. She was nothing short of saintly, and I wish I could have done more to help her. And I did that work quite successfully for a number of years, and I won 15 British Medical Association awards whilst doing it. But I knew it wasn't what I wanted to do. And the other day I was looking through my Amazon order history, which goes back to 1999. And I was rather surprised to see the books I'd been buying for so long and reading, and many of them still on my bookshelves. Why I have such an enormous library of books is because I've been buying them for 20 odd years on monastic history and art and architecture. And in 2005, a guy who's now at St Andrews published a book on the Benedictines and their art and architecture in the late Middle Ages, which I had seen in various bookshops and leafed through. And I got in touch with him occasioned by the worst case of January blues I'd ever had in January 2008, and asked him if he thought there was scope for a book on the Cistercians, on their art and architecture in the late Middle Ages. Now, the Cistercians were the monks of Kirkstall Abbey, one I know best of all, and you can see there in the background, as some of you might recognise, in that print there, which my partner Steve did for me as a PhD present, you can see Fountains Abbey. And the great monasteries, so many of the great monasteries of northern England, Rievaulx, Byland, were Cistercian monasteries. And the Cistercians are going back to that narrative of monastic decline established in the 16th century, and one which still has, I have to say, still has enormous currency, are an order which has been most beaten by historians, who a prism has been held up for them of 12th century vibrancy, personified by people like St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who to my mind is one of, he may well have been an inspirational leader, but I often find him a very unattractive figure as well. More attractively, St. Aelred of Rievaulx, arguably the most important churchman of 12th century England, an inspirational leader. His works to this day still capable of touching the souls of people of all faiths and none. Someone who's often regarded through some rather anachronistic prisms. We can talk about that a bit more later. But these remarkable characters, whereas people in the late Middle Ages, Cistercians, have been, well, not really quite up to the job, were you boys? And thank God Henry VIII came along and put you all out of your sorry misery, because, you know, those bell towers you were building, for instance, you can see the one there at Fountains. Well, that didn't conform to what the Cistercians said in the 12th century, did it? Boy, you know, there you are putting that up in the 16th century. Well, people often forget that the Middle Ages are a huge span of history, and ideals in the 12th century might not really have been ideals from the 14th century onwards. And I found it nothing short of a truly transformative experience of finding something I had always wanted to do. Actually, in fact, when somebody asked me as a little boy what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said a historian. And I had found something that finally the research topic I wanted to do, and I was taken on by a supervisor at the Courtauld, which I was utterly confounded and amazed by. I met him on a very wet, cold January evening. He said, "This is a great idea." I raised objections about why I shouldn't do it, about not having a PhD in art history. And he said, as far as I'm sorry, not having an MA in art history, having an MA in history. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, mate, not having an MA in art history and the theoretical nonsense they're taught today is a great advantage. You've got a huge enthusiasm. And he took me on. And I originally intended to do the PhD part-time, but after a year, as I said, I packed in that job, became a freelancer and did it full-time. And it provided an opportunity to engage with the buildings, with the possessions of them, and the people who lived within them, who lived and prayed within them over those centuries, their benefactors, how they've been regarded over the centuries. And it provided me with the opportunity to interact with things which I just have to say I loved. The handling illuminated manuscripts in the Bodleian and other libraries, being able to redate and reinterpret artifacts in the British Museum, making discoveries about previously unrecorded monastic books from the libraries of northern English monasteries and beyond. And indeed, I have to say, through a little bit of luck and serendipity, even being able to find some at some provincial auctions and now having them resting on my own bookshelves. These were truly quite remarkable, and gosh, I don't know, experiences which just didn't excite my mind, but also touched my spirit. And it was also provided a huge amount of healing, completing a process which had started in the mid-90s, in the early to mid-90s, in the retro choir of the former monastery of St. Mary Uvery. It was Augustinian, the Southwark Cathedral, and also how much these monasteries touched my soul. And if someone had asked me before I started doing the PhD what my religious identity was, I might have said something, well, you know, oh, I was brought up a Catholic. And then I might have said, oh, I'm a lapsed Catholic. And throughout that, I would have then said I'm a Catholic. And also of thinking with some pride and a real sense of historical connection, of a connection with the spirit that informed those monasteries and the reasons why people turned to them over all those centuries as well. And also there is something about saying that as a historian, of being prepared to admit you have an identity and relate it to what you are. Now, I gave a lecture at the Courtauld after I'd finished, long after I'd finished, was in the job at English Heritage. I'll talk about that, the job at English Heritage presently. And it was on historical perspectives, on historical narratives. And I started off, some of you, I'm sure I've mentioned Kenneth Clarke's Civilization. Some of you, I'm sure, will have watched or made, gosh, how many years ago was it now? 7 or more years ago, or even more, I can't remember. The Civilizations, which was meant to be an update of it. Now, one of my heroes has been Mary Beard, and she presented, I think it was episode 4, called The Eye of Faith. And Mary Beard is a brilliant Roman historian. She should stick to Roman history. She showed a fundamental misunderstanding of Christian art and architecture. And also, I think she showed that she really didn't like it. And she viewed medieval art and devotion and acting as an impetus devotion through the second commandment. And if she'd known anything about the commandments of the Catholic Church and the commandments of the Lutheran Church as well, actually, she would know the second commandment does not contain a prohibition about graven images, that Catholics and Lutherans to this day have a different version of the 10 Commandments to everybody else, all other Christians, and that the veneration of images in Catholicism, the way it has been problematized by Protestants, by 16th century Protestants and some later historians, well, there's very, very scant evidence of what they called the abuse of images in the 16th century and later, that people in the Middle Ages were not, in a Monty Python sense, stupid, and they could well understood that an image of a saint was just that, an image, that it was not something in itself to which there was an embodiment of the sacred. But it was all about, it struck me, that how deeply embedded in English historiography and in the English psyche that somehow, well, she talked about Ely Cathedral, going in the Lady Chapel there, and anybody who'll know that will know it suffered terrible iconoclastic damage at some point in England's long Reformation. We don't know whether it happened at the Dissolution. I think it probably was more likely to have happened in the 17th century. But she talked about the space being liberated from images of saints and prophets, and how we had been given a new image of beauty, and we owe that to the iconoclasts. And I was quite frankly appalled by it. And that series had started with a man, the curator at Palmyra, I think it was, being beheaded by ISIS for his defense of civilization, for his defense of a previous image of interpretations of the past. And here we were, she was celebrating 16th and 17th century iconoclasm, for which people were burnt, beheaded, and brutalized. But when I gave that talk, someone put their hand up and said, "Are you a Catholic?" And I responded, rather than answering that directly, I said, if I had given a talk, giving the counter argument about how brilliant the Reformation was and how it had freed England, and, these dreadful papists and their abuse of images, would you have asked me, are you a Protestant or are you a disciple of Richard Dawkins? I said, no, you wouldn't. And I said, I'm a historian, and I present I said, plentiful evidence, I think, for the vibrancy of late medieval monasticism and for the sophistication, the intellectual sophistication of the lay people and clerics alike in the Middle Ages. And of course, there were problems with medieval monasteries and problems in the medieval church, just as there was corruption in the Elizabethan church and clerics who, quite frankly, shouldn't have been allowed within 100 miles of a living in the Church of England. And, you know, but no, let's smooth out those little bits of historical, because they don't quite fit with the narrative. And so anyway, so after finishing my postdoctoral doctorate in 2012, it was examined in 2013, and very tragically, just 4 days before the degree was awarded, my mother died, and she'd been ill for some time, and I really had hoped she would make it through. And it was so the success of the award of the degree was tinged with incredible sadness that she hadn't lived to see it. And you know, there've been two very difficult times in, you know, a number of very difficult times in my life, but two that stand out as being difficult were the last year of my undergraduate degree, when I was really coming to terms with issues of my sexuality, as well as trying to job hunt and decide what I was doing, when I was desperately in the 90s, and then job hunting and dealing with grief after my mother had died in 2013. And after numerous applications, I got a postdoctoral fellowship at the Courtauld, where I carried on my research looking at religion, and very, very current in the news, across a much broader historical perspective of religion, art, and conflict. And after that postdoctoral fellowship came to an end, I was very lucky that a job became up at English Heritage. Now, as some of you may know, English Heritage it was then part of the it was a quango, it was part of the state, and it looked after and interpreted for the public 400 or so monuments vested in the care of the state, monuments of national significance, including 60-odd monasteries, and including places like Rievaulx Abbey. And I was very lucky that that job came up, and I was lucky to land the job. And the first project I worked on there was at Rievaulx Abbey. And Rievaulx Abbey had last had an interpretation project in about 1999, which had many merits, but it viewed the monastery through the prism of the time. All historians are influenced by their own times, and you might be able to cast your mind back to 1999 was a very exciting time, and again, it does seem like a lost age, in some ways a lost golden age. And there was a narrative then, I remember, of Great Britain PLC. Do people remember that? And Rievaulx Abbey was presented in the interpretation there as being the regional headquarters of an international sheep farming conglomerate, with the abbot as its local CEO. And I thought, well, that's one way of looking at it, I suppose. Sheep were very important to the Cistercian economy, but I thought it got it fundamentally wrong, that Rievaulx Abbey had to be interpreted through a prism of faith. It was a place of the sacred, and the spirit of 12th century monastic reform, of Cistercian reform, and it had been shown very persuasively by one of the great books of medieval art and architecture and monastic studies, written by sadly now dead, a guy called Peter Ferguson, himself very devout, I think, although within the High Anglican tradition, and another guy called Stuart Harrison, a brilliant technical architectural historian, called Rievaulx Abbey, Community, Faith and Architecture, I think it was, published in 1999, which showed how the spirit of and the vision of the monastic vision of St Aelred of Rievaulx had informed those buildings, and how it continued to be reflected in those buildings in later centuries, and how the rebuilt East End of the monastic church in the 13th century should not be interpreted as it has been in every single popular history program of monasticism, from Terry Gilliam's medieval lives of monks when he goes there, through to Janina Ramirez's recent, well, gosh, I say recent, it's 10 years old now, 3-part documentaries on monasticism as being somehow, oh gosh, these Cistercians got a bit of money and, like the rest of them, became hugely decadent. No, it wasn't that magnificent East End in 1220. It was built as a fitting setting for the relics of St Aelred, who remained a focus for community and veneration at the monastery and beyond until the very eve of the monastery's suppression. My PhD was on Cistercian monasteries in northern England in the late Middle Ages, and it was very much a reconciliation with my childhood, very much a reconciliation with my faith and upbringing, and also to try and redeem the historical reputation of these. Now, English Heritage, I got an opportunity to work on a much broader canvas as well, and a project I worked on early on was at Battle Abbey. And Battle Abbey is rightly interpreted as through the prism of events in 1066. And rather than it being seen as a war memorial or as a great statement of William's victory, I said it had to be viewed as a place of the spirit, a place of atonement, and a place of healing. And that's made quite explicit in the sources that William founded that monastery to pay back in a never-ending, and I might actually feel my eyes pricking when I'm saying this, a never-ending round of good works, the blood that had been shed on that day. And I broadened out the research that was being done on the monastery by looking at some of the books from the monastic library. And I was very fortunate to come across, well, actually, I didn't come across, other people had noticed this as long ago as the 1920s, an inventory of sacred relics at the monastery. There were, gosh, 100 and odd of them. And no one had ever, remarkably, no one had ever bothered transcribing them or got around to them transcribing them. And it was a remarkable historical find. And its publication, I published it in the Monastic Studies Journal just before Christmas in 2019. And it occasioned a leader comment in the Times. And, and one of the next projects I worked on was at Whitby Abbey, to go back up north. It was a very difficult project. But the monastery there, founded in the Anglo-Saxon period and refounded, it was a monastery of St Hilda, internationally famous. The famous synod took place there. And it was refounded in the aftermath of it was abandoned because of the Danish raids, Viking raids, and it was refounded in around about 1070 by a knight called Reinfrid. And the narrative story of its refoundation, again, is something which makes my eyes prick. That Reinfrid had been a knight in the army of William the Conqueror. And, sorry, he'd been in the army, probably in the entourage of the Percys, great Norman family. And he'd taken part in the Harrying of the North, which was a genocidal campaign of the Conqueror to put down a campaign in northern England. And Reinfrid is described in various sources as visiting the holy places of Northumbria. And whilst there, he puts down his sword. He's so overcome by emotion that he puts down the sword and determines to take the cowl, becomes a monk at Evesham, and then later comes back and settles at Whitby amidst the ruins of Hilda's monastery. And that sounds to me like a early example of somebody finding healing in faith, an early example of post-traumatic stress disorder, I think, as well. But again, it got to the purpose, got to the core of the purpose of those monasteries, about healing, about love, about redemption, about community. And the work I did on Whitby, again, was about the enduring importance of the late medieval monastery of St Hilda and other Anglo-Saxon saints associated with it, and how it very literally shaped the architecture of the ruins you can see today, about the translation. Hilda's relics were taken down to Glastonbury and by some miracle retranslated back up to Whitby. They may well have been stolen, but she determined they wanted to go there. But there you go. I'm aware I have spoken and rambled on. There's so much I haven't else I talked about, how I actually managed to survive and not die in the 1990s by some remarkable medical discoveries. But I think I made a vow then that I'd try and do something purposeful. And I don't know, I know that the current narrative is very, very anti-arts and humanities in popular discourse. But I have the privilege to be able to work on and help interpret for the public numerous monuments of international significance, and I think not just of architectural significance. I'm aware that these monasteries in northern England, which I visited as a working class little boy, touched my spirit and inspired me for later life to have a life change, a career which not many people from my background have been able to have. And also how people throughout the centuries have gone to those monasteries, how they have provided so much for people in the Middle Ages in terms of their belief, but in later centuries, day trips to those monasteries from people from the working class towns of northern England and beyond provided as much of a glimpse of paradise and escape as they would have been allegorized by the monks of providing in the Middle Ages. So there we are at 40 minutes exactly. If anyone has ever been at one of my conferences, they'll know I'm a stickler for time and never let people speak over. So true to my own principles, I'll shut up now, and it's over to you.
Well, thanks so much for that. And I mean, you've given us a whistle-stop tour of your life and about the art and the history and the monasticism and how it's provided a way of engaging with your childhood Catholicism and your healing and your growth. And that's, your enthusiasm is just electric. It's so amazing about where you've come, and your schooling and so forth. I mean, what's next for you? What will be next? If anybody wants to ask any questions, please just unmute yourself and just jump in. Don't feel shy. Dr. Carter's really keen to just get as much engagement from the audience as possible. But yeah, so what's next for you, Dr. Carter?
Wow, it's Michael. It's like, and I have there are my big interest. I remain an art historian primarily. That's my thing. And actually, there you go. I don't know if you can see some of the things in my flat there. I'm a bit of an antiquarian. I collect things, and this is one of the things that bits of the Middle Ages regularly come up for sale, and provincial auctioneers have got no idea often what they have. Good eye, you can get some great things. So, but no, things really excite me, but also the sacred does. They excite me as objects of the sacred, and relics, saints' relics I find fascinating, and I am working hopefully on a book which will one day see the light of day on how relics were collected by medieval monasteries, how they were prized, how they formed their identity, how the impact they had on monastic art and architecture. And this is going to be not a book of places like of great pilgrimage centres like Canterbury and Walsingham, but perhaps places like Battle, which had these collections which have to some extent been overlooked but were immensely important to them. And I also mentioned, didn't I, early on, the ghost story about Kirk's Abbey. Now, I've always loved ghost stories, and I think it's to do with my mother being Irish, and I've been told them probably at a wisely early age. But monks were great tellers of ghost stories as well. And also historians through the centuries and monastic and medieval historians have been fascinated by them as well. And some of you will, I'm sure, be familiar with with M.R. or Montague Rhodes James, one of the greatest medievalists ever. And as a young boy, I think I was 14, I encountered his ghost stories for the first time and was utterly captivated by them. And it wasn't just they were chilling tales of the supernatural. It was also because they were so antiquarian, and the stories of priceless manuscripts discovered in provincial French towns, stained glass windows in an English chapel, a monastery in the Rhineland. Gosh, they really, really did speak to what I was interested in.
Mm.
And I'd say monks were great writers of ghost stories. And these ghost stories weren't just written to give them a kind of like pleasing terror, as to use James. They provide real insights into monastic belief. And a couple of years ago, I received with a mate of mine at Manchester Metropolitan University, Dale Townsend, quite a big grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council to run a project called Revenants and Remains. And we ran these weekends at various Northern English monasteries themed around the supernatural. but the historical connections with the supernatural. It's monastic ghost storytelling, and how that provides a very, very accessible and very engaging way into medieval beliefs about that underpinned the monasteries. So anyway, I've just received a contract from Cambridge University Press with Dale to write a book on this subject, which we will hopefully finish within a year. So it may well be landing in bookshops just in time for Christmas 2025.
Oh, brilliant. We'll remember that. I'm sure we'll cover that in the tablet. And we've had a few comments in the chat box. So we've had Harold Mosley, who said, here in North Yorkshire, we have Kirkham Priory, Byland Fountains, Revo, Augustine, Benedictine and Cistercian. Is this why it's called God's own country? I think so. I think we can all answer yes from if we're up north.
Well, you know, as a patriotic Yorkshireman, I might have been exiled to London since 1988, but how could I possibly disagree? But yes, in Yorkshire, Northern England and Yorkshire more specifically, can lay claim to one of the finest assemblages of monastic remains anywhere in Europe. And you mentioned the orders they come from, and you can tell the story of medieval monasticism through the prism, the remains of those monasteries, and they're ones which I never ever tire of visiting, and I'm proud to say that I've contributed to how they're understood.
That's amazing. We've got a couple of questions that people want to ask themselves. So Angela, she did have a hand up. She said you might have answered it, but do you just want to jump in?
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me?
Hello, Angela. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for being there. It was so interesting. I was going to ask you about the ghost, but you've answered it. It was just to ask you what your next project was, but also to reference back. You said you were going to mention Kirkstall, and but I don't know. Maybe you could say a bit more, but just a little bit of detail about those medieval ghost stories and how they've sort of inspired you to write about them.
Yeah. The first big collection of them I read were written by a monk of Byland Abbey in around about 1400. And actually, M.R. James published them just over 100 years ago in the English Historical Review. He didn't do anything quite so vulgar as translate them into English. He left that for somebody else in the Yorkshire Archaeological Journey to do. But they are remarkable stories, and a lot of them involve troubled souls returning from purgatory to ask for the good works of the living. And there's one that I always some of them are very, very, very touching. And there's one about a hired servant from Revo Abbey haunting someone, actually quite brutally. I think he throws him off his horse and requesting masses and then being shriven. But some of them are much more chilling. And one of them, actually, as I said, I can see both the good and the bad in medieval monasticism and the medieval church. Involves a priest of nearby Cold Kirby. And he's buried at Byland Abbey before the entrance of the chapter house, which was a great place to be buried. But this guy, James Tankley, didn't deserve to be buried there at all, for he rises from his grave at night and wanders over the moors to Cold Kirby and gouges out the eye of his former concubine. So, well, he hasn't been observing his vows, has he? And then you'll be surprised to learn the monks well, you won't be surprised to learn, were much troubled by this occurrence and exhume Kirby's body and throw it in a local lake called the Gormire. Now, he's a kind of medieval ghost called a revenant, and they're not on the whole saved by good works or prayers. They're evil in some respects to their rotten core. They're sometimes called satellites of Satan. And some scholars, I think, perhaps anachronistically, have found connections with vampire stories in later literature. And indeed, I'll just to say on that, people might go to, of course, Whitby Abbey is indeed famous for its vampire connections, its Bram Stoker connections, and the English Heritage goes big on that. We have to get the punters in. They might go for Bram Stoker, and they do get him, but I promise you, they'll also learn about St. Begu, whose feast it is on the 31st of October, and was one of Whitby's greatest saints.
Thank you for that. We have another question in, and I think there's a question within a question here, because it's from Cleveland Beekeepers.
Oh,
Cleveland Beekeepers.
That's just because I haven't changed my name.
John from Cleveland Beekeepers has said, you haven't mentioned about the Carthusian monasteries, and I know many of the European ones now have remarkable and surprising art. Did the British one have art? I live not far from Mount Grace.
Mount Grace, indeed. And the Carthusians, thank you very much. The Carthusians were a remarkable order. They were kind of, I wrote something for the tablet. Oh gosh, it's in the blog, so it's free to access. I think it was given the brilliant title Bruno's Boot Camp. And it was about Carthusian monasticism and how they were real back to basics monks. Yes, the Carthusians did have great art and architecture. And we have some glimpses of it at Mount Grace, of like the individual cells which they lived in. And we also have some surviving manuscripts from English Carthusian monasteries, including what's called a miscellany. And it's probably from Mount Grace. And if you Google it, I think Google Carthusian miscellany, and it will come up, and you can see some extraordinary late medieval illustrations and drawings which really get to the heart of late medieval piety. But like you, I have visited some Carthusian monasteries on the continent, and that one it's a 20-minute walk from Avignon, Villiers-les-Avignon. The incredible wall paintings there are testimony to the the faith of the monks, and also just what has been lost over the centuries, and also not just lost at the Reformation, but lost because, I mean, I'm a medieval art especially, so I'm afraid when I see things obscured by the Baroque, I get a little bit cross. And then of course the Revolution and later losses as well.
So I know it's not medieval, but there's a Carthusian monastery in southern Spain, I forget where, with wonderful pictures of the martyrdom of the English Carthusians.
Absolutely. What happened to the English Carthusians was truly horrific. And some historians to this day will argue that, Henry didn't really mean to dissolve the monasteries. He wanted to make them better. And Thomas Cromwell, well, you know what? He was really kind of forerunner of a Norman Bevin. He wanted to, lovely guy, sadly misunderstood, wanted to repurpose the monasteries for more pious uses. Well, look what happened to the Carthusians. One of the first orders to be suppressed before the general suppression was taking place, they were deliberately targeted because of their vibrancy and their adherence to the principles of their religion and their ties with the papacy in Rome as well. I think that really undermines some of the arguments being put forward, and which are historical pendulum swing, and it swung slightly against Henry and Cromwell, and I think probably more to do with the Wolf Hall novels than to Dermot McCulloch's brilliant biography of Cromwell. It's kind of swung back a bit more.
Thank you for that. I hope that answers your question, John. We'll attach that article that Michael's written in the tablet to our feedback forms, so you can read that at your leisure. I've got a question in from Natalie. She's been patiently waiting. Over to you, Natalie. You're on mute, Natalie.
Thank you, Michael, for weaving together two fascinating stories, really about how a passion found you, and you followed it. One of the things that always strikes me about medieval monasticism are the Anglo-Saxon monasteries, which were often led by a woman and were sort of joint monasteries. Can you say something about where that tradition went, and maybe also something about women's communities in medieval England?
Yeah, fascinating. And these joint monasteries, these dual houses, they have their origin in Frankish kingdom, so more or less what is now called France. And I think the first one, or the most important one, was called, and I apologize if I get the pronunciation incorrect, it's Chelles, just north of Paris, and they often had aristocratic connections. The abbess of these dual houses was almost always really posh, usually a princess. And the most famous one in medieval England, in Anglo-Saxon England, is probably Whitby, but there were numerous other ones. There was one at Wenlock, where St Milberger was abbess, and other ones were distributed. I mean, the more you look, the more you find, actually. And they died. They seem to die out as a concept. Die out by, gosh, the time of the Viking invasions. Certainly here, if not before. I can't quite remember what happens to them on the continent. But female monasticism is something I have found fascinating. In my book on the Cistercians, I have a chapter on the art and architecture of Cistercian nuns, and I have it's an endless subject of fascination. Now, if male monasticism is viewed through a largely negative prism, boy, are nunneries viewed through a negative prism. It is kind of thing as these dumping grounds for unmarriageable daughters of local elites, and how, oh gosh, they weren't very good, were they? They weren't very good at praying. None of them could really read, and they were dens of iniquity and vice. And actually, well, again, there are problems with female monasticism throughout the centuries, and there were definitely people who didn't want to be there. But there was nowhere near enough nunneries in medieval England for them to act as these dumping grounds. And I think the majority of nuns who were there because they wanted to follow the religious life. And moreover, it was one of the few avenues, other than widowhood, that women could have to have some kind of independent existence. That not just if you were the abbess or prioress of a nunnery did you have stature in your local community. As a nun, you did generally. They couldn't be ordained, but their prayers were trusted. In actual fact, when I was doing my work on the Yorkshire monasteries, I found more evidence of lay people leaving bequests to nuns for prayers for the salvation of their souls than to monks, and they were often referred to as the holy nuns of Eschalt or wherever. And also has been the salaress of a nunnery. So I think another story can be told of nunneries, and a much more positive one as well.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's just a fascinating topic. How do you keep so enthusiastic after all these years of looking at monasteries and the medieval history? Well, what keeps your passion alive?
I think it speaks to my soul. And that's the easiest thing. And there's always new things to find. And also, I'll say this to myself. I did an English Heritage members event at Hales Abbey a couple of weeks ago. Very famous for having its relic of the Holy Blood visited by Marjorie Kemp, who's overcome by boisterous weeping when she sees it. It's royal sepulchre as well. And I was reading the guidebook, which I'd written about 7 years ago. I found a mistake. And it's kind of these things. But the more you learn about things, the more you reappraise. And the best historians, and I don't necessarily count myself above them, but I am prepared to say this, that I don't always think I've been right in the past. And I do know I've made mistakes. And it's about a constant process of learning. And it's learning not just from your book learning, of looking and thinking and reflecting, but also learning from visitors, English Heritage members and visitors, and also from the teaching I did as well. I have had some truly inspirational students as much as I have had inspirational teachers as well, or read inspirational texts. And although mine is a story of social mobility, whilst when I taught at the University of Kent, gosh, 10 years ago now, is where I met my good friend Angela. She was just an undergraduate then. She's now close to finishing her PhD. I met some students there, and when I found out some of their stories, I just found them truly, truly humbling. And as a teacher of them, I found it even more incumbent upon me to do my very best to act as some sort of inspiration and to help guide them for whatever path they